All right, in this video, we'll be talking about the top 5 melee DPS for Mythic Plus. Number 1 on our list is going to be the Enhancement Shaman. So the Enhancement Shaman is going to be a melee DPS specialization that blends the elemental magic with brutal close range combat. So they use the frost, fire, and lightning elements, and they wield weapons imbued with elemental energy to strike their enemies with devastating power. In the most recent 11.05 update, Enhancement Shaman has seen a ton of positive changes that's going to directly improve its Mythic Plus performance, especially in the second half of Season 1. They have one of the highest single target and AoE damage profiles in the game right now, and overall they've got some nice changes to their defensives. Historically, Enhancement Shaman has been a pretty weak specialization, at least defensively, but now due to the Season Wins talent, the Stone Bulwark talent, as well as elemental resistances, Enhancement Shaman is feeling pretty tanky at the moment. Another awesome pro playing Enhancement Shaman is their ability to change the damage profile. So you can specialize in 2 to 6 target cleave, you can specialize in like a funnel playstyle, a single target playstyle, just depending on what your group composition needs. Pretty much Enhancement Shaman can fit the bill for whatever is needed in your group. Enhancement Shaman also has some of the best utility in the game through their off healing with Ancestral Guidance. They have the Sky Fury class buff now that's going to give mastery to your entire party, and they also have, of course, the iconic Bloodlust. And also, due to the fact that there are so many poisons in the game at the moment, being able to have access to something like Poison Cleanse Totem is going to be very beneficial to your group if you're not running another Shaman already. It can also completely negate the current Devourer affix. You just simply drop your Poison Cleanse Totem, and it's like the affix never even existed. Now, there are some weaknesses. There is a pretty high learning curve with playing something like Enhancement Shaman. There's a lot of things popping up on your screen. There's a lot of keybinds that you have to deal with as a player, and it can get a little bit overwhelming. So there is that steep learning curve there. Another con of this specialization is, unfortunately, you're kind of capped out at 6 targets. There's no great way to have uncapped AoE, unfortunately. And another con of Enhancement Shaman is they don't have any sort of immunity. So unfortunately, if you do end up making a major mistake, you can't just pop an immunity and just get out of it. It's going to force your group composition to use one of those precious battle reses. Up next on the list, we have Assassination Rogue. So Assassination is going to be the master of poisons and precision strikes, specializing in dealing consistent deadly damage over time. Assassination Rogue currently has one of the strongest damage profiles across all of the DPS specializations, and their priority target and AoE damage will continue to be one of the strongest going into the second half of Season 1. So I have a really great defensive profile, and where you can get most value out of an Assassination Rogue is in those higher keys, as mobs are living for longer and longer, and you're not able to just burst them down with big cooldowns. That's where you can get the most value out of an Assassination Rogue. One of the things that makes Assassination Rogue so strong right now is the Caustic Spatter talent. So Caustic Spatter causes 40% of your poison damage dealt to splash onto nearby enemies. As historically, Assassination Rogue has kind of been the kings of single target burst damage. Just really opens up a lot of avenues for Assassination Rogue to be able to compete in AoE scenarios as well. Another thing that's great about playing Assassination Rogue is just all of the mobility that they have at their disposal. You know, very similar to playing something like a Monk, for example. You just have so many different tools under your belt that you can use to get out of a sticky situation. And it's one of the reasons that Assassination Rogues, or just rogues in general, are great in a Mythic Plus environment, is quite frankly just their ability to stay alive. So they have great damage, great defensives, and who can complain about bringing Shroud to the group? Then one other thing I want to talk about here is they're the only rogue specialization that can bring Atrophic Poison to the group. This is going to reduce the damage that the mobs are doing to your group, and it's just an additional layer of utility that they bring. Now, one of their weaknesses is there is quite a bit of uptime when playing an Assassination Rogue, so that's why they're not insanely good in lower keys, is because things just kind of die before you're able to ramp. Another weakness of Assassination Rogue is just they're kind of complex to play, especially in the AoE department. You have to be able to manage your poisons and your bleeds on all the different targets, and it's just a lot of things to track. So depending how quickly mobs are dying in your group, you may want to not, put as many bleeds or poisons on a specific target, because you're not going to get full value out of those bleeds or those poisons. So you might want to go into a more burst sort of play style. But there are a whole bunch of other builds that can help make up for this. But as the player, you have to kind of gauge how quickly those mobs are dying, and you have to pick the appropriate play style and build for that specific dungeon. So there is that extra layer of knowledge that's required for playing Assassination Rogue. Up next, number 3 on our list, we have the Frost Death Knight. So Frost Death Knight is going to be a melee fighter who's going to harness the power of ice and death to overwhelm enemies with their freezing strikes. So in the patch 11.05 update, Frost Death Knights did receive a pretty good buff to their Deathbringer hero talents, and this gives them not only one of the strongest bursts in the game, but also one of the strongest sustained damage profiles in the game as well. So very similar to the Assassination Rogue, Frost Death Knight does have a bunch of different playstyles. Now, one thing that's really nice about the Frost Death Knight tree is you don't necessarily have to pick cleave or single target damage. With a lot of Mythic Plus specializations, it's normally you have to pick one or the other, and with Frost Death Knight, they have a pretty streamlined option to where you can spec into both single target damage and AoE at the same time. Another thing that's really great about Death Knight is just how tanky they are in general. They're by default pretty tanky just because they are a plate class, but with their Death Strike with AMS, AMZ, they're just a really hard specialization to kill. Now, the main playstyle loop of playing Frost Death Knight is going to be relying on their killing machine to empower their obliterates, and you'll be able to keep that damage up through things like murderous efficiency and enduring strength. The only real downside of playing Frost DK is it really depends on the build you pick. If you go Breath of Sindragosa, you're really having to funnel a bunch of your damage into that one specific talent. If you go something like the Obliterate build, you're not going to have as much upfront cleave, but you will have more sustained cleave over the course of the dungeon. So that is a con, is if you are running the breath build, you will have to sort of coordinate that with your group. Hopefully you guys are pulling pretty big to be able to utilize the max efficiency of that talent. And then the only other real weakness of the specialization right now is just how slow it is. It doesn't have much mobility. But to be honest, that's just a very common feature of DK in general. That's how they've been for a long time, so I don't see that changing anytime soon. Overall, Frost DK is in a great spot right now. Now, following very closely behind Frost DK is its brother specialization, Unholy DK. So Unholy DK is going to wield the dark forces of decay by spreading plagues and raising undead minions to overwhelm their enemies. So Unholy DK probably has one of the highest single target damage profiles on this list, and they also have a really great AoE burst. So Unholy did not get any changes in patch 11.05. So they are going to feel the exact same as they have felt the entire expansion. Now, Unholy DK is in a sort of similar spot to Assassination Rogue, where they do require some setup time. So in most AoE scenarios, you're going to be building up Festering Wounds on targets by pressing your Festering Strike, and those will be burst through your Scourge Strike or your Clawing Shadows. So the reason the ramp time takes so long is because you have to get your Death and Decay or your Defile out on the ground. You have to build up your Festering Wounds on all the different targets, and then you have to burst them with your Scourge Strike. And then not only that, you have to dump your Runic power through Epidemic, which does take a little bit of time. Now, of course, this is only if you are in lower keys. If you're in 10 keys or higher, this is not going to be a problem at all. You know, mobs are going to be living long enough for you to get your setup going. So in that case, Unholy DK does great damage, and typically their AoE power gets stronger and stronger the more mobs they pull. So Unholy DK is in this weird spot where if your group does pull big enough, they will probably be the top AoE DPS on this list, while also being the top single target DPS on this list. The only thing is, with the way that Challenge with Peril works at the moment, with the 15-second death timers, that's going to be pretty difficult to pull off. So I would kind of consider Unholy DK to be more of a high risk, high reward sort of specialization. Regardless though, in the right group and in the right hands, this can pull some of the highest numbers on this list. Then not a ton of weaknesses, to be honest, outside of the ramp up time and their mobility, so they're going to have the same mobility issue that Frost DK had. Up next on our list, we have the Retribution Paladin. The Retribution Paladin is going to be the holy warrior that is striking enemies down with powerful light infused attacks. So Retribution Paladin did receive a tiny nerf in their Mythic Plus performance leading into the second half of Season 1 here. So their AoE burst damage profile will remain very good. And of course, they will bring a whole bunch of group-wide utility, which is one of the main pros of bringing a Retribution Paladin. So that's one of the best things about Retribution Paladin, is they're just kind of the jack of all trades. They just bring so much group utility, so much burst AoE damage. Their damage profile in general is just very strong right now. There's never really just a bad time to bring a Retribution Paladin. Then not only that, them having access to things like Divine Protection and Divine Shield just to make them one of the more tanky melee DPS specializations. And then also just the fact that they wear plate as well, you know, so very similar to one of the pros that Death Knights had, is they're just by default very tanky. So they have immunities, they have off heals, they have group healing. There's really just not much to dislike about Retribution Paladin. And then probably one of the main pros of Retribution Paladin is just how straightforward they are to play. There's a very low skill ceiling and a very low skill floor, and there's just not much to master with this specialization. I mean, there are things, don't get me wrong, probably the mastery of playing Retribution Paladin is how they use their utility, but from a damage standpoint, they're just not super hard to play, and it's going to be very easy to pull off your rotation. So they're really going to shine in lower keys, and then up to 10 keys. Of course, they can still do great above 10 keys, but that is where they really shine, is 10 keys and lower, just due to all the burst damage that they bring, and they can just completely nuke down packs. So they're going to bring great burst damage through Wake of Ashes and their Radiant Glory. They bring great utility through things like Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Freedom, and they have great personal defensives like Divine Protection and Divine Shield. Now, one of the cons of playing Retribution Paladin is they don't have the best single target damage in the Mythic Plus build. They're one of the specializations that they have to kind of pick between single target and AoE damage. And then another con of playing Retribution Paladin is all the other Paladin specializations bring the same utility as you do. So you're kind of competing with them for a spot in some situations. But for the most part, not too many cons with Ret Paladin. And their gameplay style is just going to be building and spending holy power. So one of the main things you're going to focus on is not capping your holy power and not wasting any. In playing Retribution Paladin, you're kind of switching between Divine Storm and your Templar's Verdict. And the whole AoE rotation or sort of gameplay is building up that holy power with things like your Judgment and your Blade of Justice, and then spending that holy power on Divine Storms. It's quite literally almost as simple as that. There is some additional cleaving that does come from Blade of Vengeance, but again, just a very straightforward specialization to play. Very fun, very flashy. Highly recommend picking this one up. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, consider checking out our Patreon page if you want to help support the channel, or if not, just a simple like or a subscribe goes a long way. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end. We'll see you all in the next one.